In my journey through America in the 1830s, I encountered a paradox that confounded European minds. The most religious nation was also the most democratic. While my contemporaries saw faith and freedom as natural enemies, I discovered they were essential partners. Religion in America did not stifle democracy, it made democracy possible. This revelation challenged everything we thought we knew about the relationship between spiritual authority and political liberty. In France, we had witnessed how religious institutions often supported aristocratic privilege and opposed democratic reform. Yet here, in this new world, I found churches teaching citizens the very skills democracy required: voluntary association, moral reasoning, and peaceful deliberation. Today, as secular societies grapple with moral confusion, rising authoritarianism, and democratic decay, understanding this partnership becomes more crucial than ever. The question is not whether democracy can survive religion, but whether it can survive without the moral foundations that only transcendent faith can provide. What I observed in America offers essential lessons for our contemporary democratic crisis. Chapter 1: The Foundation Paradox: How Faith Strengthens Freedom. When I first set foot in America, I expected to find religion and democracy at war. European experience taught us that religious authority meant political oppression, that freedom required liberation from faith. In France, the Catholic Church had long allied itself with monarchical power, using spiritual authority to justify political hierarchy and resist democratic change. Yet in America, I discovered the opposite. Religion was democracy's strongest ally, not its enemy. The American experiment revealed a profound truth that European intellectuals had missed: democracy needs moral foundations it cannot create for itself. Democratic government, based on popular sovereignty, requires citizens capable of self-restraint, moral reasoning, and voluntary cooperation. Without these qualities, majority rule becomes mob rule, individual liberty dissolves into license, and freedom transforms into chaos that inevitably invites tyranny. Religion provided what secular democracy could not: an external source of moral authority that limited democratic excess without destroying democratic freedom. When Americans believed in divine law and eternal judgment, they accepted constraints on their desires that no earthly power could impose. This spiritual dimension prevented democracy from becoming mere materialism, crude majoritarianism, or the tyranny of immediate gratification over long-term wisdom. I observed how religious communities taught essential democratic virtues through daily practice: voluntary association, mutual responsibility, peaceful deliberation, and respect for individual conscience. Churches and synagogues became schools of democracy, training citizens in the arts of self-governance long before they entered the political arena. Sunday services taught Americans to listen respectfully to authority while maintaining personal conviction, to participate in collective decisions while respecting minority views, and to balance individual spiritual needs with community obligations. The genius of American religious liberty lay not in banishing faith from public life, but in preventing any single denomination from dominating government while allowing all faiths to influence democratic culture. Religious diversity created a marketplace of moral ideas where different traditions could contribute to democratic discourse without any one faith becoming tyrannical. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Catholics, and Jews competed for adherents through persuasion rather than coercion, improving religious discourse while strengthening democratic habits of tolerance and debate. This religious foundation gave American democracy a stability that purely secular systems lacked. Citizens who believed in eternal principles could accept temporary political defeats, knowing that ultimate justice rested with divine authority, not human power. Faith provided the patience and humility necessary for democratic compromise, the willingness to serve future generations, and the moral courage to resist popular but unjust policies. Chapter 2: The Secular Void: When Democracy Loses Its Moral Anchor. Without religious foundation, I foresaw democracy would face existential dangers that purely political solutions could never address. The decline of faith creates a spiritual vacuum that either remains empty, leaving society morally adrift, or gets filled by dangerous substitutes that threaten democratic freedom more effectively than traditional tyranny ever could. When citizens no longer believe in transcendent moral standards, democratic discourse degenerates into pure power struggle between competing interests. Without shared moral language rooted in something higher than human preference, political opponents become enemies rather than fellow citizens with whom we disagree. The common ground necessary for democratic compromise disappears, replaced by winner-take-all confrontation that treats political victory as total vindication and political defeat as existential threat. Secular democracy tends toward what I called soft despotism, a gentle but comprehensive control that makes citizens dependent on government for moral guidance while preserving the forms of freedom. When people lose faith in eternal principles, they turn to the state as the ultimate source of meaning, value, and security. This transforms government from servant to master, citizens from free agents capable of self-governance to dependent subjects requiring constant supervision and support. The absence of religious conviction also unleashes dangerous democratic passions that corrode essential democratic institutions. Without belief in divine justice that transcends earthly politics, citizens demand immediate satisfaction of their desires from democratic processes. This impatience undermines the long-term thinking necessary for constitutional government, sustainable economic policy, and gradual social reform. Short-term gratification replaces the patient cultivation of democratic virtues and institutions. I observed how religious skepticism led to moral relativism that undermined democratic legitimacy at its foundation. If all values are merely human constructions reflecting cultural preference or historical accident, why should majority rule command respect from those who disagree? Why should minorities accept decisions they find morally repugnant? Why should anyone sacrifice personal interest for common good? Religious authority provided the external standard that made democratic decisions morally binding, not just politically expedient or temporarily convenient. The worship of human reason alone proved insufficient foundation for democratic government. Reason can analyze problems and propose solutions, but it cannot inspire the sacrifices democracy requires or generate the moral energy necessary for sustained civic engagement. Only faith in something greater than immediate self-interest motivates citizens to serve the common good when personal cost is high, to defend minority rights when majority passion runs strong, and to maintain democratic institutions when they produce temporarily unpopular results. Modern secular societies often replace religious faith with ideological fervor that proves far more dangerous to democratic freedom than traditional religion ever was. Political movements that promise earthly salvation become totalitarian precisely because they lack the humility, transcendence, and recognition of human limitation that religious faith traditionally provided to democratic societies. Chapter 3: The Art of Association: How Religious Communities Build Democratic Character. The strength of American democracy lay not primarily in its constitution, though admirably crafted, but in the character of its citizens, character formed largely through participation in religious associations. Churches, synagogues, and religious societies served as indispensable schools of democratic citizenship, teaching skills and virtues that no government institution could provide effectively. Religious communities excelled at what I consider democracy's greatest practical challenge: balancing individual rights with collective responsibility. In voluntary religious associations, Americans learned to pursue personal spiritual growth while maintaining obligations to their faith community. This delicate balance proved essential preparation for democratic citizenship, where individual freedom must coexist with civic duty, personal conscience must engage with public responsibility, and private conviction must contribute to common discourse. I marveled at how religious congregations taught the art of democratic deliberation in settings where stakes remained manageable. Church meetings, religious councils, and faith-based charitable organizations provided forums where citizens practiced reasoned debate, majority decision-making, minority protection, and respectful disagreement. These experiences prepared Americans for broader political participation by developing essential democratic skills in environments where mistakes carried lower costs than national politics. Religious institutions also cultivated what democracy desperately needed: the ability to disagree without becoming disagreeable. Faith communities regularly navigated doctrinal differences, leadership disputes, policy disagreements, and personality conflicts while maintaining unity of purpose and mutual respect. This skill, holding strong convictions while respecting opponents, pursuing truth while acknowledging human fallibility, proved crucial for democratic politics where permanent conflict would destroy the system. The voluntary nature of religious association particularly strengthened democratic character by requiring ongoing choice and active participation. Unlike family ties determined by birth or political obligations imposed by residents, religious commitment demanded continuous decision and personal engagement. This voluntarism developed citizen initiative, personal responsibility, and the habit of free choice that transferred directly to political engagement and civic participation. Religious charitable work created habits of civic engagement that enriched democratic society beyond politics. Faith-motivated citizens established hospitals, schools, orphanages, relief societies, and countless other institutions that demonstrated self-governance in action. These enterprises proved that free citizens could identify social problems, organize effective responses, and maintain beneficial institutions without government coercion, reducing dangerous dependence on state power while meeting genuine human needs. The moral authority of religious leaders provided democratic societies with independent voices capable of challenging political power when necessary. Clergy and religious thinkers could speak truth to power precisely because their authority derived from sources beyond government control, creating essential checks on democratic excess and protection for fundamental principles that majority passion might otherwise sweep away. Religious communities also taught Americans the art of leadership without domination. Church governance required pastors, elders, and committee chairs to exercise authority while remaining accountable to congregational will, to guide without controlling, and to serve rather than rule. These experiences prepared citizens for democratic leadership that strengthened rather than threatened free institutions. Chapter 4: The Tyranny of Individualism: How Faith Connects Isolated Citizens. Democratic equality, while liberating individuals from traditional hierarchy and inherited status, created new dangers that only religious conviction could address effectively. The greatest threat to democratic freedom proved to be not political oppression but social atomization, the tendency of democratic citizens to withdraw from public life into purely private concerns, weakening the social bonds democracy requires to survive and flourish. I observed how democratic individualism, taken to dangerous extremes, produced citizens who cared only for immediate family and personal interests while remaining indifferent to broader community welfare. This pathological individualism differed fundamentally from healthy independence by severing the social connections that give individual freedom meaning, purpose, and moral foundation. Democratic equality, by destroying traditional hierarchies, risked destroying all social bonds unless new forms of voluntary association replaced old forms of inherited obligation. Religious faith provided the essential antidote to destructive individualism by connecting citizens to purposes larger than immediate self-interest and temporal concerns. Believers understood themselves as part of broader spiritual communities with obligations extending beyond personal desires and family advantage. This religious perspective countered the democratic tendency toward social fragmentation by maintaining transcendent loyalties that bound citizens together across differences of class, region, and immediate interest. Faith communities created networks of mutual obligation that prevented democratic citizens from becoming isolated atoms pursuing purely selfish goals. Religious institutions maintained social bonds across economic, racial, and regional divisions that political institutions alone could not bridge effectively. These spiritual connections proved more durable than purely secular associations because they rested on transcendent foundations that survived temporary disagreements and changing circumstances. Religious conviction also motivated citizens to engage in public life rather than retreating into private concerns when civic participation became difficult or costly. Faith traditions that emphasized service to others, stewardship of community resources, and responsibility for social justice naturally led believers towards civic participation, charitable work, and political engagement. Religious duty complemented rather than competed with democratic responsibility, reinforcing civic obligation with spiritual motivation. The decline of religious conviction that I anticipated would leave democratic citizens adrift in what I termed democratic despotism, a gentle but comprehensive social control that made genuine independence impossible while preserving the appearance of freedom. Without religious community to provide meaning, purpose, and social connection, isolated individuals would inevitably seek security and guidance from an increasingly powerful state that promised to meet needs that voluntary associations once satisfied. I foresaw how weakened religious conviction would lead to the worship of material progress and immediate gratification that would undermine democratic patience and long-term thinking. Citizens without faith in eternal purposes would demand instant satisfaction from democratic institutions, destabilizing the gradual processes that democratic governance requires. The loss of religious time perspective, thinking in terms of eternity rather than immediate gratification, would make democratic societies incapable of the patient reform and institutional development that sustained freedom requires. Religious individualism, properly understood, strengthened rather than weakened social bonds by teaching citizens that personal salvation and community welfare were intimately connected, that individual dignity derived from divine creation rather than social status, and that personal freedom carried corresponding responsibilities to serve others and contribute to common good. Chapter 5: The Source of Moral Authority: Why Democracy Needs Divine Command. Democracy faces a fundamental paradox that secular philosophy cannot resolve. It requires moral foundations that democratic processes themselves cannot create or validate. Majority rule can determine policy and elect leaders, but it cannot establish the moral principles that make majority rule legitimate or the fundamental rights that even majorities must respect. This is where religious conviction becomes indispensable. It provides the external moral authority that gives democratic decisions binding force and protects essential freedoms from democratic tyranny. When citizens believe in divine command and eternal moral law, they accept obligations that transcend human preference, political expedience, or temporary majority will. This transcendent source of authority prevents democracy from degenerating into mere power struggle between competing interests or sophisticated tyranny exercised through popular will. Religious conviction creates the moral common ground necessary for democratic compromise, peaceful disagreement, and the recognition that political opponents remain fellow human beings deserving respect and consideration. I observed how American religious diversity actually strengthened rather than weakened this moral foundation. Multiple faith traditions contributed different insights to democratic discourse while sharing core convictions about human dignity, moral responsibility, divine judgment, and the necessity of justice. This religious pluralism prevented any single denomination from dominating moral discourse while maintaining society's overall spiritual character and commitment to transcendent principles that limited political power. The absence of religious authority leaves democratic societies vulnerable to moral relativism that undermines democratic legitimacy at its deepest level. If moral standards are merely human constructions reflecting cultural preference, historical accident, or majority will, why should minorities accept majority decisions they find objectionable? Why should citizens sacrifice personal interests for common good? Why should anyone respect individual rights when collective interest seems to demand their violation? Religious conviction provides compelling answers to these fundamental questions that secular philosophy struggles to address persuasively. Democratic societies that lose religious foundation often seek substitute forms of moral authority that prove far more dangerous to freedom than traditional faith ever was. Political ideologies, scientific materialism, cultural nationalism, or radical individualism may fill the spiritual void left by declining religion, but these secular substitutes lack the humility, transcendence, and recognition of human limitation that traditional religious faith provided to democratic societies. Secular ideologies tend toward totalitarian claims about human perfectibility and earthly salvation that religions focus on eternal judgment and divine mercy traditionally moderated. Religious moral authority also creates essential limits on democratic power that protect individual conscience and minority rights against majoritarian tyranny. When citizens believe in divine law that transcends human legislation, they reject government policies that violate fundamental moral principles regardless of popular support or political convenience. This religious conscience provides crucial protection for individual rights and minority interests that purely secular democratic theory struggles to justify convincingly. Faith-based moral conviction gives democratic citizens the courage to resist popular but immoral policies when majority passion threatens justice or fundamental freedoms. Religious believers who answer to higher authority than public opinion can challenge democratic excess when necessary, serving as democracy's moral conscience and guardian of principles that make democratic government worthy of respect and allegiance. Chapter 6: The Balance of Sacred and Secular, Preventing Religious Tyranny. While democracy desperately needs religious foundation, the relationship between faith and freedom requires careful balance to prevent religious tyranny from replacing political oppression. The American experiment taught crucial lessons about maintaining this delicate equilibrium that protected both democratic liberty and spiritual conviction, demonstrating that strong religious influence and robust democratic freedom could coexist beneficially when properly structured. The genius of American religious liberty lay in preventing any single faith from capturing government power while allowing all faiths to influence democratic culture through persuasion rather than coercion. This separation of institutional church and state enabled religious ideas to shape public discourse, moral reasoning, and citizen character without creating ecclesiastical domination of political institutions or theocratic control of democratic processes. Religion influenced democracy indirectly but powerfully through the formation of citizen virtue rather than direct institutional control. I observed how religious competition strengthened rather than weakened faith's contribution to democracy. When multiple denominations competed for adherence in a free religious marketplace, each tradition had to articulate its values persuasively rather than relying on government enforcement or inherited privilege. This competition improved religious discourse, eliminated complacent orthodoxy, and forced faith communities to demonstrate their worth through service and moral example rather than political power. Religious diversity also created natural checks against theocratic tendencies that protected both religious freedom and democratic governance. Different faith communities monitored each other for attempts at political domination, creating mutual accountability that prevented any denomination from establishing religious tyranny. Baptist vigilance protected Catholics from Presbyterian dominance, Jewish watchfulness guarded against Christian privilege, and Protestant competition prevented Catholic hierarchy from controlling democratic institutions. The voluntary nature of religious association proved essential for maintaining proper balance between faith and freedom. Citizens who chose their religion freely rather than inheriting it through birth or accepting it through government assignment developed stronger personal conviction while respecting others' different choices. This voluntarism created religious commitment that was compatible with democratic tolerance and more effective at contributing to democratic discourse than coerced conformity ever could be. I recognized serious dangers when religious enthusiasm exceeded proper bounds and threatened democratic institutions. Religious fanaticism could become as tyrannical as secular ideologies, using spiritual authority to justify political oppression, suppress dissent, and eliminate the pluralism that democracy requires. The key was maintaining religious influence on democratic culture while preventing religious control of democratic institutions, allowing faith to shape citizen character while protecting political processes from ecclesiastical domination. The American model demonstrated how strong religious conviction could coexist with genuine respect for religious minorities and non-believers. Believers who understood their faith as personal relationship with divine authority rather than political program for social control proved most compatible with democratic freedom and most effective at contributing constructively to democratic discourse. Faith that sought to persuade rather than coerce strengthened democracy while preserving religious integrity. Proper separation of church and state protected religion from political corruption while protecting politics from religious tyranny, creating conditions where both faith and freedom could flourish without destroying each other through inappropriate interference or mutual contamination. Chapter 7: The Modern Crisis: Democracy's Spiritual Emptiness and Renewal. Contemporary democratic societies face precisely the crisis I anticipated. The gradual erosion of religious conviction has left democracy spiritually empty and morally confused. Without transcendent foundation, modern democracy struggles with challenges that purely political solutions cannot address effectively, revealing the prophetic accuracy of my observations about religion's essential role in sustaining democratic freedom and citizen virtue. The decline of religious authority has created what I feared most: citizens who mistake license for liberty, confuse majority will with moral right, and reduce democratic governance to sophisticated power distribution rather than pursuit of justice and common good. Democratic discourse increasingly resembles marketplace bargaining between competing interests rather than moral deliberation about shared principles, fundamental rights, and transcendent purposes that give political life meaning and direction. Modern technology intensifies these problems by enabling democratic manipulation through sophisticated propaganda, social media echo chambers, and emotional appeals that bypass rational consideration. Citizens without strong moral foundation or transcendent perspective prove especially vulnerable to manipulation, tribal thinking, and the immediate gratification that undermines democratic reasoning, patient deliberation, and the long-term perspective that constitutional government requires for success. The rise of political ideologies that function as secular religions demonstrates democracy's continued need for transcendent authority and spiritual meaning. When traditional faith declines, citizens often transfer religious devotion to political movements, creating dangerous fanaticism that threatens democratic tolerance, pluralism, and the recognition of human limitation that religious humility traditionally provided. Political messianism becomes more dangerous than religious conviction because it lacks transcendent perspective and divine judgment that moderated earthly ambition. Yet I also observe encouraging signs of spiritual renewal that could revitalize democratic institutions if properly channeled towards civic engagement rather than private spirituality alone. Growing interest in meditation, mindfulness, contemplative practices, and authentic community suggests human beings cannot live by material concerns, immediate gratification, and individual autonomy alone. This spiritual hunger creates opportunities for renewed religious engagement with democratic life that could restore the moral foundations democracy requires. Faith communities that understand their role in supporting democratic culture rather than controlling political institutions can provide essential moral leadership for contemporary challenges that secular approaches cannot address adequately. Religious traditions offer resources for addressing inequality, environmental degradation, social division, and moral confusion that purely secular political programs lack. Faith-based perspectives on human dignity, stewardship, community responsibility, and transcendent purpose provide alternatives to both radical individualism and collectivist tyranny. The path forward requires neither abandoning religious faith nor subordinating democracy to ecclesiastical authority, but rediscovering the creative partnership between spiritual conviction and political freedom that made American democracy both stable and dynamic. This renewal demands religious communities that engage constructively with democratic discourse while maintaining spiritual integrity, and democratic institutions that welcome religious contributions while protecting religious freedom. Modern democracy's survival may depend on citizens recovering appreciation for transcendent purposes that give individual freedom meaning and democratic participation moral significance. Religion provides these purposes more effectively than any purely human alternative, connecting temporal political engagement with eternal spiritual values that motivate sustained civic virtue and democratic commitment. Conclusion. The relationship between religion and democracy proves far more complex and essential than either secular skeptics or religious fundamentalists typically recognize. Democracy without spiritual foundation becomes mere materialism, power struggle, and the tyranny of immediate gratification. Religion without democratic freedom becomes oppressive fanaticism that contradicts faith's deepest insights about human dignity and divine love. Together, properly balanced, they can create societies that honor both human dignity and divine authority, individual freedom and transcendent purpose. The challenge for contemporary citizens is rediscovering this creative partnership while avoiding the extremes of secular emptiness and religious tyranny that destroy both faith and freedom. Democracy's future may depend on whether free societies can maintain the spiritual conviction that makes political liberty both possible and worthwhile, creating conditions where citizens pursue eternal purposes through temporal engagement and transcendent values through democratic participation.